So welcome this morning. This week's Parsha is called Re'eh. Re'eh means see. And it begins with Moshe continuing his speech to the people saying, see, I have placed before you today a blessing and a curse. If you follow my commandments, you get the blessing. You don't follow my commandments, you will get the curse. He tells them when you come to the promised land, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to go to Mount Gerizim, Mount Eval, just near the town of Shechem. And over there, you're going to stand on the mountains while the Levites turn to you and say, and list 11 things that if you follow the Torah within these 11 things, you will be blessed. If you do not, you will be cursed. And everybody will answer Amen. And we'll get to what those 11 things are. Will be in Parshat Ki Tavo in a couple weeks' time. We'll go through it again in more detail. The Torah then warns us when you come to the Promised Land to destroy all the idolatrous places, the temples, and all of the idols. But we are warned never to destroy God's name or anything belonging to God. Anything that is dedicated for God is forbidden to destroy. We are also, then the Torah tells us when you come to the Promised Land, first you will build a temporary temple that until you're ready to build a permanent temple. They ended up building a temporary temple in Shiloh that lasted for many centuries until the days of King David, when finally Israel was secure, and then they built the permanent temple in Jerusalem. The Torah then also tells us that when we we can slaughter an animal, we must slaughter it as instructed. We went to the class, we went through the Jewish traditions of slaughter, how to slaughter an animal. We're not forbidden from eating the blood. We must drain out the blood. We also went to the class on that, on the draining out the blood, koshering as we call it. And we must also cover the blood. The Torah gives us, the Torah then tells us if there is a prophet who tells you to worship idols, do not listen to that prophet. They are a false prophet. If someone tries to convince you to turn away from God, turn away from Judaism, well, generally we have to love every person, and we have to, even if they don't do everything they're supposed to, we should still love them and still care for them. The one exception is somebody who tries to convince us to move away from God's ways. Somebody who is a bad influence, keep away from them. Don't show them any love. Keep far away from them. Yes. The Torah then goes on. It goes through many, many different commandments. I'm not going to cover all the commandments because we have many commandments in the next 3 parshas. Moshe is essentially goes through almost a third of the commandments of the Torah in the next 3 parshas. So he then goes through the laws of kosher, which we already had in Leviticus. Tells us that animals, you can eat animals that chew their cud and have split hooves. It lists 10 types of animals. It then tells us for things in the water, they must have fins and scales. We'll talk about those in a moment. Then it goes through lists of kosher birds. There's a list of 24 non-kosher birds. All other birds are kosher, although we cannot definitively identify which birds are not kosher, which leaves us with assuming all birds are not kosher unless we know otherwise. And we have a couple signs that we can use to tell whether a bird is kosher, subject of its own. Maybe one day we could do a class on kosher birds. Then the Torah commands us to, every time when we have produce in the land of Israel, in addition to the tithes that we give to the Levite, we must separate a second tithe, another 10% of our produce, exchange it for money and bring the money to Jerusalem or to the temple and use the money to buy food there by the temple during the pilgrimage. We're then told about the Shemitah, every 7 years, or every 7 years during a Shemitah year. Last year was a Shemitah year, the year before this year. And at the end of a Shemitah year, all loans are absolved. As you recall, the end of last year, before that period, we did a class on the absolving of loans, and we went through the workaround that our sages came up with so that we don't have to worry about it. We're then told the mitzvah of tzedakah, of giving charity. If someone's in trouble, you must give them everything that they need in order to help them and make sure that there will always be poor people, but you must always open your hand towards the poor. And then the Torah concludes, goes through a number of other mitzvot. I'm not going to go through again all of them, but concludes going through the various festivals, Passover, and then Shavuot, and then finally the festival of Sukkot. So that is the Parsha in short. As you see, it goes through many, many, many different commandments, and we're going to have that the next 3 weeks. We're going to go through different commandments. Let me take a few questions on the Parsha quickly. Go ahead, Eli.
You said we need to slaughter the animal in a humane way to make it kosher, right?
I did not say that.
Alright, so what's the way you can make it kosher?
I said we have to slaughter the animal according to the laws of slaughter that we have discussed in a previous class.
The way you slaughter the animals and the seven law of Noah?
That is an excellent question. Are non-Jews who are Noachites obligated to slaughter in a way? That's a very good question. That's an issue that's debated. There are definitely opinions that say that Noachites should also use slaughter in order to avoid harm, causing the animal unnecessary pain. I don't think that's the consensus among scholars in Noachite laws. I think generally, as long as they don't cause the animals pain, they're okay. They're not required to fulfill the 613 commandments, and therefore not required to slaughter as Jewish law requires Jews. Anyone else have a question on the Parsha? No? Okay. So just also to mention a day coming up this week. Tomorrow is the 20th of the month of Av. It is the yahrzeit of Rebbe Leivik, who is the Rebbe's father. I have scheduled a class to do about him, very fascinating personality, who was arrested and exiled by this in the Soviet Union, and unfortunately died there in exile in the middle of nowhere in 1944. So one day we'll do a class on him, but it is his yahrzeit tomorrow. So let's get to our topic for today, because the Parsha does speak about kosher. We will talk about one of the laws of kosher. We've spoken before about ritual slaughter. We've spoken before about koshering. I think we once did a class some time ago where we went through the modern kosher. I think we called it industrialization of kosher food. But now we will talk about kosher fish. Yes?
What time is your class tomorrow?
Sorry?
What time is your class tomorrow?
Talk about it. So, what makes fish kosher? Or what makes kosher fish? So the Torah tells us, both in Leviticus, in the portion of Shmini, as well as in Deuteronomy, in this week's portion, Re'eh, that for fish to be kosher, it needs two things. It needs to have fins and scales, snapir v'kaskeset. The Talmud points out that all fish that have scales have fins. So you really just need to look for the scales. You don't need to look for the fins, because if it has scales, you know that it has fins. Now, whether there are any exceptions to that rule or not is a fascinating discussion beyond the scope of our discussion today, but we presume that is, and generally all fish that have fins, have scales, have fins. Now, there are many fish, though, that have scales, and many fish that do not have scales. There is no particular groupings of fish. There's many different groupings of fish and sea animals. There's no particular grouping of sea animals that have scales or particular groupings that don't have scales. Rather, all different species of fish, various types, have fins, various types don't. Even within the same species, there are often subgroups of fish, subtypes of fish within a species that have scales, and subtypes of fish within a specific species that do not have scales. It's not a particular type of fish that have scales. Again, many fish have scales, many do not. There is no particular type of fish that have scales or don't have scales. There is no way to define as a general rule which fish will have scales and which fish will not, even within specific species. Some types within a species may have scales, and some types within a species may not. So I'm going to give you some examples. I will give you some examples. So how do we know what exactly scales are. How do you define scales? So the Ramban, Rav Moshe ben Nachman, one of our primary halachic authorities from the 1200s, 1300s, 13th century, he says that in order to be considered scales, you have to be able to easily peel them. In other words, when the fish is out of the water, you can peel off the scale and it will come right off without causing any damage to the skin. Without getting into why this is the accepted definition, this is the consensus in halakha and Jewish law is that this is the accepted definition. If you are able to easily peel off the scales without damaging the skin, it is considered scales. You should be able to put your finger underneath it and just peel it off, put it in front of it and just peel it off with your nail. If you cannot peel it off with your nail easily without damaging the skin, then it is not considered scales. So any fish with scales that can be peeled, and by definition they would have fins then as well, is considered kosher. If it does not have such scales, it is not considered kosher. Now, we have complex rules for preparing meat and fowl. Meat and fowl need firstly to be slaughtered, shchita, they need ritual slaughtering, which we once did a class on shchita. It involves, there's a number of rules of exactly how to slaughter, very particular type of knife, a very difficult knife to create, a perfect shchita knife, it's called, there's a Hebrew term for it, it's a chalaf. There's particular rules of exactly how to slaughter. Even once slaughtered, the animal needs to be checked for any fatal internal concerns, and there's a long list of various things that would render the animal a treifa, or fatally wounded, that would not allow it to, that would make it considered not kosher. Both animals and fowl must be checked to ensure that they don't have any such fatal wounds. If they do, they're not kosher. Furthermore, both animals and fowl, their blood is forbidden to eat. And so we have a process of removing their blood, a koshering process that involves koshering with kosher salt. That's, of course, why kosher salt is called kosher salt, because it's used for the koshering process. That's all for meat and fowl. However, fish do not require any preparation in Jewish law. You take it out of the water, you can kill it any way you like. There is no defined way to kill the fish in halacha, in Jewish law. And you can then eat it without checking its health or checking it for fatal flaws. And its blood is kosher to eat as well. There are also in animals, there are parts of the animals that are forbidden to eat, the sciatic nerve, various fats in domesticated animals. In fish, there are no details. Once a fish is kosher, any part of the fish can be prepared in any way, killed in any way, and any part of the fish is kosher. We do have to be careful with some forms of preparation, such as cooking the fish, which involves some other laws of kosher, or even filleting the fish, and we will touch on those in just a moment. So I'll soon talk about how to choose kosher fish. Let me first take questions. Any questions? Yes.
How do they drain the blood?
Of the fish?
Yeah, or any animal.
Of any animal, that's a subject of its own. We did a class previously. I can send you the link. Sorry? Any way you want. You cut it open and let the blood go out, however you want to do that. Fish don't have a lot of blood, but however you like to do. You're allowed to eat the blood. Fish blood's kosher. You don't have to drain the blood. Yes?
So if you go to a fish store that carries all...
I'm going to tell that. What happens if you go to a fish store? What do you do? I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Before that, let me first go give you some examples of kosher and non-kosher fish. Some examples of kosher fish, and this list came from Chabad.org. Albacore, bass, cod, flounder, grouper, perch, salmon, snapper, trout, whitefish, most tuna, but not all tuna, mackerel, pike, carp, herring, tilapia, and many, but again, not all, sardines. So those are some of the more common fish that are kosher. Non-kosher fish include catfish, eel, freshwater cod, shark, and of course seafoods, other seafoods like shellfish, crabs, lobster that are not technically fish are all non-kosher as well.
What about swordfish? I didn't hear.
Very good question. So I'll get that in a moment. So there were scholars over our history, most notably Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, prominent rabbi of Prague in the 18th century, who were of the opinion that sturgeon is kosher since it does have scales. However, most scholars, and the consensus has been for hundreds of years among halachic scholars, that sturgeon is not kosher. Though sturgeon does have scales, those scales cannot be easily peeled. They're part of the skin, they're hard to remove, and therefore the consensus has been, as far back as we know, although there were opinions that said it was kosher, the consensus has been that sturgeon, is not kosher. It was an issue of it became a big political issue in the early 1800s. One of the hard breaks in the Hungarian Jewry between traditional Judaism and what they called their neolog or Reform Judaism there was over the kosher, whether sturgeon was kosher or not. But that's a subject of its own. One day, God willing, we're going to do a class on the split in Jewry in Hungary. It's a fascinating discussion. Sir? Herring is on the list, yes. Herring is kosher. You can rest assured. There has also been a big debate over swordfish. Swordfish, apparently, when you take it out of the water, does not have visible scales. Swordfish do have scales, at least many species of swordfish do have scales when they are young. And then they shed their scales before they reach adulthood. So there are many rabbis that permit the eating of swordfish. There is some debate. The Talmud actually mentions this concept of fish that have scales and then shed their scales. There's some debate as to whether they were referring to the swordfish or not. And it's an issue that remains a debated question till today. All major kosher organizations in the United States and around the world do not consider swordfish kosher and will not allow for swordfish or any swordfish derivative to be used in things that they stamp as kosher. But that said, there are, although the consensus among kosher organizations is generally not to consider it kosher, there are definitely prominent rabbis today that believe that it is kosher and should be kosher.
Why scales?
That's an excellent question. Why scales? We're going to get to that at the end. So, I believe so. That's a very good question. I don't know how edible they are, but I believe they are. But don't count me on it. So I believe they do have scales. So, if they have scales, they're kosher. Now, there are lists of kosher fish out there. You can go online and you can get from various kosher organizations have lists of kosher fish. There's a big problem with lists of kosher fish. Fish have many, many different names. Often the same name is used for many different species of fish. In other words, there are no agreed upon names for many, many common types of fish. And different places will use different names, and often it can mean many different things. Technically, every fish today has a scientific name in Latin. That's its real name. Those are definitive. Those are a very definitive name for a very exact thing that fish scholars, ichthyologists they're called, use when studying fish. However, in marketing and branding, all sorts of different names are used for different species of fish. Often the same name, trout, could be used for multiple different species, not all the same species, and the like. So just because you see a name, it's hard to know which name is used for what. And just because you see a name on a list, it's hard to know that that is the fish that is kosher. Regardless, even if you know the names of the fish that are kosher and you know which fish is kosher, you would need to know that the fish you are being sold in the fish market is indeed the same fish that they're selling it as. In reality, because of the confusion over fish names, and because of many different fish types, there are many fish types, and many of them are very, very similar. Often fish are sold under names of similar fish. There is little regulation that requires fish to be titled correctly. So there aren't really laws and rules on titling names of fish. And so they're not very careful to make sure that they name the fish. If there's multiple similar fish that are technically different with different names, they're not always careful to give you the correct name of the fish that you are buying. And often the fishermen themselves don't even know the correct name and how to name it correctly. So for all those reasons, when you see a fish in the store, rather than paying attention to the name, what you need to pay attention to is the scales. You need to look for the scales. If you see scales, you know it's kosher. If you don't see scales, you don't know if it's kosher. It may be kosher. You don't know if you don't see scales. Once a fish is filleted, then there is no way to know if it is a kosher fish or not. In fact, even a fish expert, even a professional ichtologist who studies fish, when they just see the meat of this fish, it is virtually impossible to identify without the skin, to identify and differentiate exactly which type of fish it is. Even for an ichtologist, because there are many different types of fish that are very similar. And so a filleted fish, there is no way to know which fish it is. There is no way to know if it's kosher. The only way to know if it's kosher is to see it with the skin and to check for scales. So if you are going to a fish market where you are buying fresh fish, you always have to buy fish with skin on it and check for scales. If the fish is filleted and it has no scales, you can only trust that it is kosher if there is sealed kosher supervision, which either there is a mashgiach, there is a kosher supervisor who is either there is a kosher supervisor who is supervising. Either there is a kosher supervisor who is supervising the production and making sure that these fish are kosher, or usually they'll make sure that only kosher fish are coming into this fish market or it is industrialized production. I'll talk about industrialized production in a moment, but otherwise, the only way you know if a fish is kosher is by seeing the skin and seeing the scales on the skin. Other than that, if you do not see the scales, it must be sealed with a hechsher, with kosher supervision. Otherwise, there is no way to know that the fish is kosher.
I mean, I don't know that because in English, but the fish, you read from it, when they open up on the side.
Gills? Yeah, all fish have those.
With the kosher too, right?
I don't believe so. There are other signs of kosher the Talmud gives us. Exactly how to use those signs is debated. So as far as we're concerned, there are other signs about the shape of the fish and the shape of the head and the like. But regardless, the only sign that we look for is scales. The only sign that is relative is scales. Now there is one exception to this rule, that you can only purchase fish in a fish market if you see the scales. The one exception to this rule is salmon. Salmon and steelhead trout and a couple other similar fish have a unique pinkish, orangish color, that salmon color, that is very unique color and is not found in any non-kosher fish. This pinkish color is only found naturally in wild salmon. It is also not found in farmed salmon. Why is it found in wild salmon? So apparently the wild salmon, their natural food, which comes from lobsters or things that have certain chemicals in them, and that creates the salmon color. Now, most salmon that you buy in the market today is not wild salmon, is farmed salmon. Salmon, of course, is somewhat limited, and there's many laws limiting the catching of wild salmon, and therefore, and salmon's a pretty popular fish. So most fish today is farmed salmon. There's a lot of money in farmed salmon. Now, salmon farmers realized early on in the salmon farming process that since their fish are not getting the same feeding on the same foods as wild salmon, the fish are turning white, and their salmon was white. Tastes the same, it's the value is the same, but it looks different, and nobody wants to buy it because it doesn't look like salmon. And so what they actually came up with is, they came up with a synthetic way of essentially taking the same chemicals that are found in the lobsters and the food that the salmon eats, that the wild salmon eats, and they inject it into, or they feed it to the farm salmon, and the farm salmon that way turn the same color. So the question was then asked, if we can synthetically turn salmon pink, can you turn non-kosher fish pink? So a lot of research was actually done on this to see if it was possible to turn other fish other than salmon and steelhead trout pink. And apparently it is not possible. Even if you feed them the same chemicals, they do not turn pink. Only salmon naturally will turn pink when fed those chemicals. So it still remains today that there is no other fish that can be naturally turned the color of salmon, or that can be turned the color of salmon, even chemically, even in a factory. You cannot turn fish the salmon color if it was not kosher. So therefore, because of that, if you see salmon sold in the store, even if it is filleted, and you recognize that it has the pinkish salmon color, then you know, or the pinkish reddish color of salmon or steelhead trout, you know that it is kosher, and you don't have to worry about it being a non-kosher fish. So you don't have to check. So while generally fish, you need to make sure it has skin on it and you see the scales, with salmon, you do not need to check that there is skin on it, and that you see the scales, because if you recognize the color, and we all know the color of salmon, then you can be assured that it is kosher. Will they one day invent a way to turn other fish that color? Possibly. Currently, as far as we know, there is no way to do it.
So they're putting dye in it. So is that
So they could try putting dye in. You could dye anything, any color today. But when you dye something, it doesn't look the same as when it was naturally colored that way. They've tried to color other fish with dyes by putting dye in it after it was killed, and it does not have the same equal color all across the flesh as salmon does. No, they feed farmed salmon essentially chemicals taken from the lobster that, it's the same chemicals apparently in carrot that make carrots orange, that when you eat a lot of carrot, you turn orange. It's carotene, it's called? Beta carotene. So they feed those to the salmon, and they turn, nothing unhealthy about it.
So it's something healthy, it's not unhealthy.
It's healthy, nothing to worry about. There is, however, yes?
If I buy kosher fish from a fishmonger, then is it still kosher because they may have cut it up?
Excellent question. Okay, so you can go to a fish store, you can buy fish. You must, if it's salmon, even if it's filleted, you can know it's salmon. If it is a different fish, you must make sure that the skin is on, and you see the skin is on connected, not just wrapped in the skin, but it's actually connected to it, and you can see the scales. Now, you have, though, if you go to a fish store, a fish market, you have another problem with filleted fish. And that is, given that there are many species of kosher and non-kosher fish, Often the same knives, cutting boards, or machines are used for different fish. Not often, always. And therefore, you can assume that the fish, when the fish was cut, it was done so using a non-kosher knife and a non-kosher cutting board. Cutting board is not such a big issue. You just have to rinse it off if in case there's any residue on the cutting board from the non-kosher fish. A knife is a bigger problem. Anything that the knife touches becomes not kosher and cannot just be rinsed off, but needs to be removed. So you would have to remove the entire outside layer of the filleted fish in order before eating it if you suspect that it touched a non-kosher knife. That would be a very challenging thing to do. So not very practical. A more practical solution that is widely done is to bring your own knife. Bring your own knife with you. You have to ask, if you go to a market, you have to ask the person to wipe down and clean down their cutting board to make sure there is no residue on the cutting board. You give them your kosher knife, make sure they don't use it for anything else, and only use it for the fish that you have chosen that you know is kosher. And that would be the only way to do it in a fish market. Other than that, there is no way to know that the fish was only used on a kosher knife. The same is today, along with the butcher stores, the fish markets are kind of out of fashion. There aren't too many of them left. They're a dying breed, along with the bakeries, because we know the supermarkets have taken over all the fresh food business. And today, you don't really go. You just go to the market. Everyone goes to the markets and buys fresh fish off the shelf out of the fridge. So those fish are produced not one at a time, but are produced in factories. So if there is still skin on it, you can see it's kosher. You would be able to buy it. However, you would need to know where they filleted it, how it was filleted. If it's filleted in a factory that is used only for a very specific type of fish that is kosher, then you have nothing to worry about. If it is used filleted in a factory that fillets all sorts of fish, then you got a problem. How would you know? So you would need professional kosher supervisors to go do that research into the factories. I don't know which stores, supermarkets, their factories produce which fish. What I do know is that a lot of research has been done into the Costco fish, because I guess a lot of people buy from Costco. And the Costco salmon, at least, and steelhead trout that they sell are produced in factories that only produce salmon and steelhead trout and don't produce anything else. So the filleted salmon that you buy off the shelf in Costco, doesn't need to have the skin on it because you recognize all the steelhead trout, you recognize the color, and that it's made in a factory exclusively used for salmon and steelhead trout and not used for anything else. So and therefore it only has kosher things. It's just filleting. There's no other ingredients in it. And so therefore that would be kosher. You would be able to buy it. Other than that, there are lists of various places, various factories of some of the larger supermarkets, which ones for particular fish are careful. Usually salmon, because they're produced, especially farm salmon or even salmon boats, are produced in particular salmon places. They're usually used exclusively for salmon and for nothing else. Other fish, not necessarily so.
If you wash a fish with salt and water, not good enough?
It doesn't help, no. If it was cut with a non-kosher knife, you must cut off everything that would have touched the knife, which is possible but hard to do. Yes?
So if you buy a fish in a non-kosher market, in a fish market, and it's got the skin on and the scales, can you have them descale the fish there and then
absolutely,
and it stays kosher then?
Absolutely. Just tell them to give them your own knife. Bring your own knife from home and give them your knife. They might not like using your knife, but it's too bad.
To descale? Not to pull.
Oh, to descale, would it, well, if you're going to cook the skin?
I don't cook skin. I don't-
Well, if you're going to take the skin off, why do you need it descaled?
Because it's messy.
Okay, then you can ask them to descale it. Yes, if you're not gonna cook the skin, it doesn't matter if the skin is kosher. The knife is just touching the skin; it shouldn't be an issue. If you want,
Feels good that the scales get everywhere.
right? I mean, if you're gonna cook the skin, though, the skin becomes not kosher if they touched it with a non-kosher knife. So, but bring your own knife. If you insist on it, they'll do it in areas where today there aren't a lot of fish stores. Not a lot of people go to fish markets anymore. Once upon a time, not too long ago, we all remember when we went to fish stores, right? When we were a little younger. And so back then, fish stores in Jewish communities, where a lot of Jews kept kosher, were familiar with kosher knives. And all the Jews brought in their kosher knives. That's what everyone did. They came to the fish store with their kosher knife.
So would that be a meat knife?
No, just a kosher knife. Doesn't
What would you use that knife for at home? Would it be
whatever you want.
meat
Just
knife or?
doesn't matter. Whatever you use it for.
Okay, so it doesn't
Just
matter.
kosher. We'll get to meat in a second.
What is a carp?
Carp is kosher, yes.
So, and carp roe or whatever,
I'm going to get to roe in a second. Great question.
okay.
Today, most of the fish that we buy, or a lot of the fish that we buy, is processed. You buy it in cans or in jars, whether it's tuna or salmon that's bought in cans, or sardines or herring. Many fish today are bought in cans or jars. When you buy it, well, sardines often in the jar has still the skin on it. You can even see, right? The herring still has the skin on it. But a lot of herring doesn't. But if it doesn't have the skin on it, there's really no way to know which fish went into it. You need to know in the processing plant exactly which fish went into it. So therefore, many kosher certifications will have a mashgiach, or a kosher certifier, a Jew who is an expert in certifying kosher fish, to be there on the boats or at the ports when the boats come in to ensure that only kosher fish go into production, to go through the nets, go through the production, make sure the fish are sorted. They come in, they bring in these massive fishing boats, they bring in these huge holes of fish, and then they have to sort the fish, and they need a mashgiach there, a kosher supervisor who supervises the sorting of the fish, make sure that the tuna pile only has tuna and nothing else. Generally tuna anywhere in groups, so it doesn't usually have much else. Other fish do kind of come in mixes. So, but they have to make sure that it's sorted properly, that it really has exclusively the kosher fish, and it needs to be fully supervised. And so you need to make sure that any of these things, whether it's canned tuna, canned salmon, canned sardines, has a kosher certification, which generally will mean that there was a mashgiach, there was a kosher supervisor there at the production and saw everything that went in. While we once did a class on industrialized kosher, and we spoke about how if it has ingredients where there's no issue, sometimes the factory just needs to be spot checked. But when it comes to kosher fish production, there could be anything going into the kosher fish production, anything being hauled in from the boats. And so you would need a mashgiach, you would need a supervisor there to make sure that only kosher fish is being hauled in. Most fishing today happens in Southeast Asia. That's because the Pacific is where most of the fish is, and the best fish is, and the cheapest labor is in Southeast Asia. So Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, that's kind of the center of most of the fish that we get today here is coming from there. And so there are mashgichim that go down there, fly down there, and are supervising fish. Here in the United States, most of our fish production is in Alaska. There are mashgichim over there that fly down and supervise fish production. Now, there is another issue that with fish, in addition to which the mashgiach also needs to look out for, and that is cooking. And this is an issue in general in kosher production, where there is a law that we spoke about this when we spoke about kosher previously. There is a law that a Jew is only allowed to eat food cooked by another Jew. If it is cooked by a non-Jew, we're not allowed to eat it. There are some workarounds for that law, things that can be eaten raw. It's okay if it's cooked by a non-Jew. There's certain other exceptions. One exception is if a Jew lights the fire. If a Jew lights the fire and it's cooked by a non-Jew, then that's fine. That's what we do here with our omelets for our breakfast in the morning. That's what we do. That's what's done in kosher restaurants, where there's often non-Jews working there. So the same needs to be done in the production of fish. Most fish are sold cooked, unless you're getting sushi. Most of it's cooked. Tuna, sardines, whatever you're buying is cooked. If it is cooked, even certain smoked fish is cooked. Not lox. Lox I don't believe is cooked. But certain smoked fish is cooked, and so they would need a Jew, to be there at the production to light the fire, so that their Jew was involved in the cooking process as well. Sorry?
What's the reason why I do light the fire?
Excellent question. That's a discussion for another time. Beyond the discussion of fish, we could talk about it afterwards.
How much do you get paid for lighting a fire? I get the job.
It's a great question. But yes, people go down. I know people that work as mashgichim, as kosher supervisors, and part of their job is to go down to factories, light the fires. Yes.
So canned fish needs to be cooked. Canned fish is usually
cooked. It's always cooked. Yes.
So the fire has to, or the switch needs to be, however it's done.
It needs to be lit by a Jew. Yes. So, but there are mashgichim down there in Thailand or wherever they're producing the tuna to make sure that all this happens, and therefore you can only buy tuna with the kosher certification.
And you have to be Jewish to be a mashgiach.
You have to be Jewish to be a mashgiach, yes. You have to be Jewish, and you have to know what you're doing. What about roe or eggs from a fish? So the rule is that roe is only kosher if the mother fish is kosher. Mother's kosher, then the eggs are kosher. Mother's not kosher, eggs are not kosher. So caviar, which comes from sturgeon, we said the consensus is that it is not kosher, would also not be kosher. Other roe can be kosher if it comes from a kosher fish. There is no way to know if the roe comes from a kosher fish or not. There's no way to differentiate. It needs to be supervised by, you've got to see it taken out of the fish, or you have a mashgiach, a kosher supervisor, supervise it. So if you buy roe in the store, you've got to make sure it comes with a certification, sealed and certified that it is kosher. Now the Torah forbids us from mixing meat and milk or eating them together. We've done a class previously about the rules of not mixing milk and meat. Our sages have expanded that prohibition not to mix fowl and milk. We're not allowed to mix fowl and milk either or eat them together. However, fish is not part of that prohibition to be eaten with milk or part of the prohibition to be eaten with meat. It is what we call in Yiddish, but it's become an English word, pareve. Pareve is a Yiddish word which means neither meat nor milk, just plain. And it can be then eaten with meat or it could be eaten with milk. And so fish is plain. It is not meat, it is not milk. However, the Talmud tells us that eating fish and meat together is unsafe. It is dangerous. Now, today, we know of no adverse medical effects that happen when you eat fish and meat together. However, the prohibition mentioned in the Talmud still stands. And we therefore do not eat fish and meat together, or when we do not cook fish and meat together, or fish and fowl together. And that is why at Jewish dinners or meals, we always have separate fish courses and meat courses. At our Shabbat dinner, we first have a fish course, then we'll have a meat course, And that's somewhat universal, but we Jews have done that. We may be the source of that. We do that because we have this rule coming from the Talmud that we do not eat fish and meat together. However, unlike the prohibition of not mixing milk and meat, where we have to have separate utensils, different pots, different plates, different ovens for meat and milk, we can eat fish and meat in the same utensils. So long as you clean them out in between and you don't eat them together, you can use meat utensils for fish, you can use milk utensils for fish, so long as there's no residue of the meat in the utensil, it is a residue of the fish in the utensil when cooking meat, it is fine to use the same utensils. You are not required to have separate pots for fish. There is, however, a curious Jewish custom that we don't know where or when it started, but there is an old Jewish custom that Jewish homes always had separate pots, not separate ovens or separate dishes, but separate pots for cooking fish. Why? We don't know when or how that arose, but there is a custom to have separate pots for cooking fish, just for cooking. And so those that cook their gefilte fish had separate pots for cooking fish. It is not, it's not required in Jewish law, but it is an old custom. And though they had separate pots, they did not have separate ovens, they did not have separate dishes. Many Sephardic Jews also have a custom not to mix, and there are also some Ashkenazic Jews. Many Sephardic Jews have a custom not to mix dairy and fish either. So they do not eat bagels with cream cheese and lox. That is a distinctively Ashkenazic food. And the Bet Yosef, writes, Rav Yosef Karo, who is the major halachic authority for Sephardic Jews from the 16th century, writes not to mix milk and fish. And so based on that, many Sephardic Jews, or most Sephardic Jews, do not mix milk and fish.
I adopted
The Ashkenazic, okay,
yeah.
yes.
That's the only thing I took.
So why is it that fish require fins and scales? So like all kosher laws, both the laws of which animals we can eat, the laws of preparing the animals, laws of not mixing milk and meat, all the various different kosher laws, most kosher laws have no rhyme or reason. They fall under a category of laws called chukim. There are various types of laws. We've spoken about this in previous classes dedicated to why some laws make no sense, some commandments make no sense. That we split the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah, into three categories. There are civil law or commonsensical laws that make sense. Don't steal, don't kill, honor your parents. Then there are laws that are symbolic, have very clear symbolism. Keep Shabbat to remember how God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Keep Passover to remember the Exodus, right? Symbolic laws. And then there are laws where God says, this is what I want you to do. I'm not going to tell you why. So we have many such mitzvot, many such commandments. Almost all the kosher laws fall under that category of chukim, laws that we don't have any reason for. This is what you're supposed to do. I'm not going to tell you why. So what makes fish kosher? They need to have fins and scales. Why fins and scales? That's what God said. There is no reason for it. We have no logical, no known reason for the fins and scales rules. However, Maimonides tells us that the Rambam, that while we don't have reasons for many of the commandments of the Torah, for the chukim, we can take inspirational lessons from them. In other words, we can find symbolic lessons from the various commandments that we don't have reasons. These reasons don't fully explain the commandments, but they do help us essentially find something meaningful in the commandments. So the Rebbe found meaning in the fins and scales, and he explained that the fins and scales have a very important lesson to teach us. Scales are a layer of protection that the fins have on them that protect them from predators. They teach us that we need to protect ourselves from doing bad, from predators within ourselves, in other words, our own evil inclination, by having very, very strong values, a strong sense of right and wrong, a strong belief that God is watching us and expects us to do the right thing. And that strong set of values, that strong sense of right and wrong is what protects us from doing bad, even when tempted to do bad, even when we're in a situation where it feels like we really want to do something, we know it's wrong, we cannot do it. Strong sense of values, a strong sense of right and wrong. And we learned that from the fish's scales. Fish also have fins. Fins is what the fish use to swim, or at least to direct themselves as they swim, to propel themselves forward. It's not enough just to protect ourselves and make sure we do the right thing, but we need to also be productive and active and moving and developing and growing and making an impact. And that we learn from the fins. We need to both have protection and we need to be growing. But what's interesting is all fish that have scales have fins. But not all fish that have fins have scales. Why is that? So, in our inspirational lesson, you can be active and making an impact and be a big doer and a big activist and changing the world, but you still do bad. You still do the wrong thing. So, in other words, having fins, being active is not going to guarantee protection. But on the other hand, if someone has what we call yirat shamayim, fear of heaven, they have a fear to do the wrong thing, they have very strong values, a strong sense of right and wrong, that they know that God expects of them certain things and they will do no matter what they're supposed to do. When you have that strong protection, you will automatically generate the fins as well. You will have the drive to then do the right thing as well. So we have to remember that the first and most important thing that we need is the scales, the protection that we have to protect ourselves, that protection, that sense of right and wrong, that sense of values, that we will never do the wrong thing because God said not to do it. And if we're not supposed to do it and He's watching us, how can we do the wrong thing? So when we have that strong sense of protection, we will get the fins as well, the sense to continue growing, continue developing, working to make an impact. So while this is an inspirational lesson that we can learn from the fins and scales, it is not, of course, a reason why we can only eat fish with fins and scales. Ultimately, we do not have the reason why we only eat fish with fins and scales. And yet, we know that is what it takes for kosher fish. We know that's how we now know to find kosher fish in a fish store, you got to look for the scales. Unless it's salmon, make sure if it's filleted to use a kosher knife, and otherwise to make sure that it has kosher supervision. So that is our lesson about fish. The Talmud tells us that fish represent the righteous. Why do fish represent the righteous? Because fish live inside the sea, similar to the righteous that live inside the sea of God or live within a sense that God is all around them, God is everywhere, and see God in front of them wherever they go. And so therefore fish represent the righteous. Our sages also say about fish that they never close their eyes. Their eyes are always open. They don't sleep, right? Other animals sleep, mammals sleep, but fish don't sleep. They don't rest. We take that lesson also from fish, and it is said that is why we eat fish on Shabbat. We are supposed to eat both fish and meat or fowl on Shabbat. The reason why we eat fish is because it represents the righteous. So go enjoy your fish. Kosher fish, of course.